Lady Annalise Thorne had come to understand that hope was a finite resource, like the dwindling supply of good firewood in their draughty manor or the credit with the local merchants. At 24, she was a relic of a season long past, her name a footnote in the ledgers of forgotten dances. Her family's fortune, once a roaring fire, was now little more than a pile of cold ash. The tapestries were faded, the silver was sold, and the silence in the cavernous halls was broken only by the sound of her father's anxious pacing. Her world had shrunk to the size of a gilded cage, and the door was about to be locked for good. The key was held in the hand of a man she had never met, the Duke of Blackwood. His name was a thunderclap in any drawing room, a synonym for immense power, staggering wealth, and a chillingly remote disposition. He was a creature of myth and shadow, a man who had not attended a London season in a decade, preferring the brooding solitude of his northern estate. And he, for reasons she could not fathom, had agreed to a marriage contract with the daughter of a ruined baron. It was not a proposal. It was a transaction. Annalise was the final, most valuable asset to be sold off to settle the Thorne family's crushing debts. Her father had presented the news not with joy, but with the grim relief of a man who had just managed to plug a hole in a sinking ship with his own heart. Annalise felt the cold finality of it settle in her bones, a permanent chill that even the weak afternoon sun could not touch. She was to be his Duchess. The title felt like a shroud. Society would whisper that she was the luckiest woman in England, but Annalise knew she was merely the most elegantly packaged sacrifice. She imagined the Duke as a man carved from granite, with eyes like chips of ice and a heart that beat with the slow, methodical rhythm of a banker counting his gold. The arrangement was as peculiar as the man himself. His solicitors had handled everything with brisk, impersonal efficiency. The Duke, they had explained in a dry letter, would send his senior household staff ahead to prepare Hawthorne Manor for his brief stay before the wedding. He himself would follow, though his exact date of arrival was uncertain. He preferred, the letter stated, to travel without fanfare. Annalise found the ambiguity unsettling. It was another exercise of power, another way to remind them of their station and his. He would arrive when he deigned to arrive, and they would wait, suspended in a state of anxious readiness, like servants awaiting a master they had never seen. Her mother had flown into a flurry of activity, trying to polish the tarnished remains of their life into something that might pass for respectable. But Annalise sought refuge where she always did, in the stables. Here, the scent of hay and worn leather was honest. The quiet snuffling of the horses was a comfort. Her mare, Willow, was the only creature left in the world who did not look at her with an expression of pity or expectation. Willow was simply a friend, a warm and steady presence in a life that had become cold and precarious. The Duke's people had arrived 3 days prior, a formidable squadron of housekeepers, valets, and footmen who moved through the manor with a quiet competence that highlighted the Thorne family's own decline. They did not mock or sneer, they simply improved, their silent work a constant reminder of the world of effortless perfection Annalise was about to enter, and the world of genteel poverty she was about to leave behind. She had avoided them all, retreating further into herself. On the 4th morning, with the dread of the Duke's imminent arrival a knot in her stomach, she went to the stables earlier than usual. The sun was still a pale wash of gold against the eastern clouds. She wanted one last ride, one final hour of feeling the wind in her hair and the solid strength of Willow beneath her, a fleeting illusion of freedom before the cage door swung shut. As she entered the familiar, dim interior of the stable block, she saw a man she did not recognize. He was mucking out a stall, his back to her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the simple, rough-spun clothes of a groom. His movements were efficient and strong, the pitchfork handled with an ease that spoke of long practice. He was not one of her father's aging retainers. He must be new, perhaps hired by the Duke's steward to bring the neglected stables up to standard. She cleared her throat. The man stopped his work and turned slowly. Annalise's breath caught for a fraction of a second. She had expected a simple country fellow, perhaps with a dull, pleasant face. This man was different. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, his jaw firm, his mouth a straight, unsmiling line. His hair was dark, cut shorter than fashion dictated, and his eyes were the most startling color of grey, like a winter storm over the sea. They were intelligent, watchful, and utterly unreadable. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a severe, almost dangerous look. For a moment, they simply stood there, the space between them thick with the scent of hay and the quiet morning air. He was a stable hand. She was the lady of the house. Yet his gaze was not deferential. He looked at her directly, with an unnerving stillness, as if he were taking her measure. It was she who felt the sudden, absurd need to look away. She stiffened her spine, annoyed at her own reaction. He was a servant. She was his master's intended bride. She lifted her chin, adopting the cool, distant tone she had heard other ladies use when addressing their inferiors. It felt unnatural on her tongue, like a borrowed costume. "You're new," she stated, her voice sounding thinner than she had intended. He gave a short, single nod. His expression did not change. He offered no name, no explanation. The silence stretched, and Annalise felt a flicker of irritation. He should have bowed, or tugged a forelock, or, at the very least, spoken. "I require my horse," she said, her tone sharper now. "Saddle Willow for me. Immediately." The man's grey eyes held hers for another longed moment before he gave another curt nod. He turned without a word and walked towards Willow's stall. Annalise watched him, a strange mixture of indignation and an emotion she could not name churning within her. There was an arrogance in his silence, a self-possession that did not belong to a man of his station. His hands, as he retrieved the saddle, were large and calloused, yet they moved with a surprising grace, calming Willow with a single, gentle stroke along her neck. He worked with a focused intensity, his movements economical and precise. He was clearly an expert horseman. He did not hum or whistle as the other grooms did. He was a creature of profound silence. As he tightened the girth, he glanced back at her. It was not a glance for approval, but a quick, assessing look that made her feel strangely transparent, as if he could see the frayed edges of her composure. She told him exactly where to stand, ordering him to lead the horse out into the yard. He obeyed without question, his quiet compliance somehow more unsettling than defiance would have been. He held the reins as she mounted, his shoulder brushing against her boot. A strange jolt, like static on a dry day, passed through her at the brief contact. She ignored it, gathering the reins in her hands, her fingers tightening on the worn leather. "What is your name?" she asked, looking down at him. She needed to put him in his place, to re-establish the proper order of things. He looked up, the morning light catching the silver in his eyes. "Alec," he said. His voice was deeper than she had expected, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. Just Alec, no surname. "Well, Alec," she said, her voice crisp, "see that the stables are kept in perfect order. The Duke of Blackwood is a man who expects perfection in all things." A flicker of something, amusement, irony, passed through his eyes, so fleeting she thought she might have imagined it. "I will endeavour to meet His Grace's standards, my lady," he replied, his tone perfectly level. She urged Willow forward, cantering out of the stable yard and onto the open fields, desperate to put distance between herself and the unnerving stable hand. But even as the wind whipped tears from her eyes, she could not escape the feeling of his gaze on her back, a silent, weighty presence that she could not seem to shake. The days that followed fell into a strange and unexpected rhythm. The Duke did not arrive. Her mother's anxiety grew with each passing sunset, but for Annalise the delay was a reprieve. And each morning she was drawn to the stables. She told herself it was for the ride, for the precious hour of freedom, but she knew, in a secret corner of her heart, that it was not just the horse she went to see. Alec was always there, a constant, silent figure. He never initiated a conversation, but he would answer her questions in his clipped, concise way. She learned nothing about him, where he was from, his family, his past. He was a man without a history. Yet, in his presence, Annalise found herself doing something she had not done with anyone else. She began to talk. It started with small things, comments about the weather or the condition of the bridle path. But the man's quiet attention was like a gentle hand, coaxing words from her that she had kept locked away. He would listen, his grey eyes fixed on some distant point, his hands busy polishing a piece of tack or brushing down a horse. He never interrupted, never offered platitudes or easy advice. He simply listened. One morning, feeling particularly trapped by the weight of her impending future, she found herself speaking of the Duke. "They say he is a hard man," she said, ostensibly to Willow, as Alec tightened the saddle girth. "Cold, ruthless in his business dealings, a man who has never been seen to smile." Alec's hands stilled for a bearish second before resuming their work. He said nothing. "I suppose it is foolish to expect anything else," Annalise continued, a bitter taste in her mouth. "He is buying a wife to secure an heir, and my father is selling a daughter to secure his estate. It is a contract. Feelings do not enter into it. Why should he smile?" She expected silence, as always. Instead, he spoke, his low voice startling her. "Perhaps a man's reputation is the wall he builds to keep the world out," he said, his back still to her. Annalise stared at his broad back, stunned. It was the longest sentence he had ever uttered to her, and it was a thought of surprising depth. It was not the sort of thing a stable hand said. "What would a man like the Duke of Blackwood have to fear from the world?" she asked, a genuine question. He turned then, holding the reins out to her. His expression was as guarded as ever, but there was a new intensity in his eyes. "Perhaps he does not fear the world," Alex said slowly. "Perhaps he fears what the world has tried to take from him." He said no more, leaving her to ponder the cryptic remark as she rode out across the dew-kissed fields. Her curiosity about him grew into a quiet obsession. She watched him when she thought he was not looking. She noticed the way his calloused hands could be surprisingly gentle when calming a skittish foal. She saw the keen intelligence in his eyes when he assessed a horse's lame leg, an intelligence that seemed wasted on manual labor. He was a puzzle, a contradiction in rough-spun clothes. He began to leave small things for her. A sprig of wild heather tucked into Willow's bridle, its purple bells a startling splash of color. A patch on the woodland path, previously impassable due to mud, filled in with stones and gravel. One afternoon, after she mentioned her frustration at being unable to capture the exact shade of a wildflower in her sketchbook, she found a perfect specimen of that very flower lying on the mounting block the next morning, its roots carefully wrapped in damp cloth. She never acknowledged the gifts, and he never mentioned them. They were part of their silent language, a delicate thread of connection woven in the quiet hours of the early morning. She began to feel a strange sense of peace in the stables, a feeling of being seen for who she was, not for her title or her marriage prospects. With Alec, she was not Lady Annalise Thorne, the bartered bride. She was just a woman who loved horses and wildflowers. The illusion was shattered by the arrival of Lady Beatrice Finch. Beatrice was the daughter of a neighboring earl, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her venom. She had once considered herself a potential match for the Duke of Blackwood, and Annalise's engagement had been a source of profound irritation to her. She arrived one morning under the pretense of offering congratulations, her smile as sharp and brittle as spun glass. She found Annalise in the stable yard, sketching the intricate pattern of a spider's web, while Alec replaced a worn shoe on Willow's hoof. Beatrice's eyes swept over the scene, her lip curling in disdain. "Annalise, my dear," she purred, gliding closer. "I see you are already acquainting yourself with the rustic charms of your new life. But must you spend so much time with the help? People will talk." Her gaze flickered to Alec, dismissing him as one might dismiss a piece of furniture. Annalise felt a hot flush of anger. "I enjoy the quiet of the stables, Beatrice," she said, her voice tight. Of course you do, Beatrice said, with a laugh that died like a candle running out of air. But conversing so freely with a common groom, it is hardly fitting for the future Duchess of Blackwood. His Grace will expect a certain standard of decorum. Alec continued his work, his back a wall of stony silence. But Annalise saw his shoulders tense, the muscles in his forearms tightening as he hammered the nail into the hoof. His Grace is not here, Annalise snapped, her patience gone. And my conduct is my own concern. Is it? Beatrice raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She took a step closer to Alec, looking down her nose at him. You, groom, fetch my horse, and try not to get any of your filth on the reins. Annalise opened her mouth to protest, but Alec rose slowly to his full height. He turned his head and looked at Lady Beatrice. He said nothing. He did not have to. The sheer, unadulterated cold in his grey eyes was more potent than any shouted insult. It was a look of immense and ancient power, of absolute authority. It was the look of a predator assessing a trivial annoyance. Lady Beatrice, for all her aristocratic hauteur, physically recoiled. The colour drained from her face, and her smug smile vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and something akin to fear. She took an involuntary step backward, her mouth opening and closing silently. For the first time in her life, she was utterly speechless. Alec held her gaze for a beat longer, then turned his back on her without a word and went back to his work, the moment of chilling intensity gone as if it had never been. Beatrice, flustered and unnerved, stammered a hasty farewell to Annalise and practically fled the stable-yard. Annalise stared at Alec's back, her heart hammering against her ribs. That look. It did not belong to a stable hand. That was the look of a man who commanded armies, who broke lesser men with a single word. It was the look she had imagined in the eyes of the Duke of Blackwood. The thought was so absurd, so impossible, that she dismissed it immediately. But a seed of profound confusion had been planted. Who was this man who called himself Alec? A week later, a messenger arrived. The Duke of Blackwood would be arriving in 2 days' time. The house was thrown into a final, frantic spasm of preparation. Her mother fussed over Annalise's wardrobe, her father rehearsed his welcoming speech, and the Duke's staff moved with an air of crisp, controlled anticipation. For Annalise, the news felt like a death sentence. The reprieve was over. The quiet world she had built for herself in the stables was about to be torn down. Her future, in the form of a cold and powerful stranger, was riding towards her. On the morning of his scheduled arrival, she slipped out of the house at dawn. She needed one last ride, one final moment of peace. She found Alec in the stable-yard, watching the sunrise. He looked different today, a tension in his stance that had not been there before. He saddled Willow in their usual silence, but it was a heavy, weighted silence now, thick with unspoken things. Annalise felt a desperate urge to say something, to thank him for the small kindnesses, for the quiet companionship that had been her only solace. "He comes today," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My future arrives." Alec nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "So I have heard." "I am afraid," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I am afraid of being trapped in a life that is not my own, with a man who sees me as nothing more than a part of a bargain. I feel like a bird being sold to a collector, valued only for my plumage, destined to live out my days in a beautiful, empty cage." She looked at him then, at his strong, impassive face. "I wish," she started, then stopped, her throat tight with emotion. "I wish things were different. I wish I could marry a man I could respect. A man who is quiet and kind. A man who notices wildflowers." Her eyes met his, and the meaning was unmistakable. She was not just speaking of a hypothetical man. She was speaking of him. "I wish I could marry a man like you, Alec." The words fell into the quiet air like stones into a frozen pond. The vulnerability of her confession hung between them, raw and terrifying. She had said too much. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She expected him to look away, embarrassed, or to offer a clumsy word of comfort. Instead, he held her gaze, and for the first time, the mask of the stoic stable hand fell away. She saw a flicker of profound emotion in his grey eyes, regret, pain, and something else she could not decipher. "Annalise," he said, and the sound of her Christian name on his lips was both a shock and an intimacy that made her tremble. He took a step closer, and then another. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to close the immense social gulf that separated them. "My lady," he began again, his voice strained, "there is something I must tell you. Something I should have told you from the start. My actions have been dishonorable. I have allowed a deception to continue for far too long." Annalise's mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. Was he a thief? A fugitive hiding in plain sight? "My name," he said, his voice low and heavy with significance, "is not Alec. That is merely a part of it." He paused, and his grey eyes, the colour of a winter storm, held hers captive. "My full name is Alastair Edward Callum, and I am the Duke of Blackwood." The world tilted on its axis. The sounds of the morning, the birdsong, the rustle of leaves, faded into a dull roar in her ears. She stared at him, at the man she had ordered about, the man she had confided in, the man to whom she had just confessed her deepest fears about the very person he claimed to be. It was impossible. It was a cruel, monstrous joke. But as she looked, really looked, she saw it. She saw the innate authority that had always simmered beneath his quiet demeanour. She saw the aristocratic bones beneath the guise of a commoner. She remembered the look he had given Lady Beatrice, the look of a duke. The stable hand vanished, and in his place stood the formidable, powerful man she had dreaded for weeks. A wave of cold fury washed over her, so potent it chased away the shock. It was followed by a crushing wave of humiliation. Every conversation, every shared silence, every secret fear she had laid bare before him, it had all been a lie, a performance. He had been watching her, studying her, judging her like a farmer inspecting livestock before a purchase. "You," she whispered, the word laced with venom. She took a step back, away from him, as if he were suddenly contagious. "How could you? How dare you?" "Annalise, please," he said, taking a step towards her, his hand outstretched. "Allow me to explain." "Explain?" Her voice rose, sharp and brittle. "Explain what? Your cruel little test? Did I pass, Your Grace? Was my performance as the naive, chattering fool to your liking? Did you get all the information you needed to decide if the merchandise was suitable?" The pain in his eyes looked genuine, but she could no longer trust anything she saw in his face. "It was not like that," he insisted, his voice raw. "I was wrong. It was a coward's act. I came here because I am so tired of being a title. I am surrounded by people who want something from the Duke of Blackwood. I wanted just once to meet the woman I was to marry as a man, to see if there was anything real beneath the surface of the arrangement." "And so you spied on me," she accused, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her splintering composure together. "You listened to me confess my most private fears about you, and you stood there in silence. You let me make a complete and utter fool of myself." The memory of her final confession, "I wish I could marry a man like you," burned in her mind, a brand of pure mortification. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You did not make a fool of yourself. You showed me your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. You showed me the woman you are when no one of importance is watching. I came here looking for a duchess, a suitable, placid partner to manage my household. That was all I thought I wanted." He looked away for a moment, towards the rising sun. "What I found," he continued, his voice softer, "was a woman who loves her horse more than society, who finds beauty in a simple wildflower, and who has more courage and integrity than anyone I have ever met. I found a woman I could not help but admire. A woman I—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. His confession, his vulnerability, did little to soothe the sting of his deceit. Her trust, a fragile thing to begin with, had been shattered. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. "The game is over. You have your answer. Am I to curtsy and pretend this whole charade never happened?" "No," he said quietly. "What happens now is up to you." He looked at her, his expression stripped of all artifice. For the first time, she saw not the Duke, not the stable hand, but a man who looked profoundly lonely. "The contract can be broken. I will not hold you to it. I will find another way to settle your father's debts. A loan, an investment. It will be done, discreetly. You will be free. You will not have to marry the man who deceived you." It was the last thing she had expected. He was offering her an escape. He was giving her a choice. The very thing she thought had been stolen from her. She could walk away from him, from the title, from the cold, gilded cage she had dreaded. She could be free. She looked at him, at this complex, infuriating, and unexpectedly honorable man. The anger was still there, a hot coal in her chest, but beneath it, something else was stirring. He had been wrong to deceive her, but his reasons, born of loneliness and a desire for something genuine, resonated with a painful familiarity. He had built a wall around himself, just as he had suggested, and she, unknowingly, had found a crack in it. She thought of the quiet companionship in the stables, the shared silences that were more comfortable than any conversation she had ever had. She thought of the wildflowers, the repaired path, the look of cold fury he had directed at Lady Beatrice on her behalf. Those were not the actions of a duke testing a potential bride. Those were the actions of Alec. A kind man. The man she had come to care for, and the man she had been forced to marry, were one and the same. The monster she had imagined was a fiction. The reality was infinitely more complicated and far more human. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the waking world. He waited for her verdict, his posture rigid, his face a mask of anxious suspense. He had placed all his power, all his control, into her hands. "If I marry you," she said slowly, the words tasting strange on her tongue, "there will be no more lies, no more tests." A wave of relief so profound it was almost visible washed over him. His shoulders, which had been tense with strain, relaxed. "Never," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "I will spend the rest of my life earning the trust I so carelessly broke." "You will not be an easy man to live with, Your Grace," she said, a hint of her old fire returning. A small smile, the first she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his severe face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Alistair," he corrected her gently. "And I have it on good authority that you are not a particularly placid woman, Lady Annalise." She could not help the faint smile that answered his. The anger had not vanished, but it had softened, making way for a fragile, tentative hope. It was not the future she had ever imagined, but it was a future she could now choose, not just endure. "Then I suppose we shall have to learn to manage each other, Alistair," she said softly. He closed the remaining distance between them. He did not touch her, but stood before her, his gaze full of a warmth she had never seen there before. "I would like that very much," he said. And in the quiet of the stable yard, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a new and uncertain future began, not with the ringing of wedding bells, but with the quiet exchange of names. A year later, the Duchess of Blackwood stood on a terrace overlooking a garden bursting with life. The stone walls of Blackwood Castle had once seemed to her a prison, but now they felt like a sanctuary. The halls that had been silent and cold were now filled with the light that streamed through clean windows and the scent of the flowers Alistair had planted for her. Her art supplies, once a secret hobby, were now housed in a sun-drenched studio he had commissioned in the East Wing. The walls were covered with her sketches, landscapes of the wild northern moors, detailed studies of the local flora, and, in a private portfolio, several portraits of a serious, grey-eyed man caught in rare moments of unguarded stillness. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Alistair stood there, no longer the stern, remote duke of reputation, nor the silent, guarded stable hand. Marriage had softened the hard lines of his face. He smiled at her, a genuine, easy smile that still made her heart catch in her throat. He came to stand beside her, his arm sliding around her waist, pulling her close. He followed her gaze to the garden below. "The roses you wanted have arrived," he said. "I had them planted this morning." "You spoil me," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Hardly," he countered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I am merely making up for a rather poor first impression." She laughed softly. Their unconventional beginning was a story they shared, a private joke and a constant reminder of the strange path that had brought them together. The anger she had felt on that day in the stable-yard had long since faded, replaced by a deep and abiding love built on a foundation of absolute honesty. He had kept his promise. There had been no more lies. He had shown her the man behind the wall, a man of quiet passions and profound loyalty. He was still a man of few words, but she had learned to read his moods in the subtle shift of his expression, in the touch of his hand on the small of her back. And she, in turn, had brought warmth and life into his solitary world, teaching him that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a bridge between two souls. Their life was not one of grand romantic gestures, but of small, steady kindnesses. It was in the books he left by her bedside, knowing she would enjoy them. It was in the way she made sure his favorite tea was always waiting after a long day of managing his vast estates. It was a love that was quiet, patient, and as solid as the ancient stones of the castle around them. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. "Choosing this life. Choosing me." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. She looked into his stormy grey eyes, eyes that were no longer unreadable to her, and saw the flicker of his own lingering insecurity. "I did not choose a title," she said softly, her voice clear and sure. "I did not choose a duke. I chose a quiet, kind man who notices wildflowers, and I have never regretted it for a single moment." His eyes softened, and he leaned down, pressing a gentle, lingering kiss to her lips. It was a kiss of quiet contentment, of promises kept, and of a future that stretched before them, bright and full of hope. A person's true worth, she had learned, was not found in their title or their wealth, but in the hidden gardens of their heart. And she, the bartered bride, had been given the key to the most beautiful garden of all.